Good morning, everybody. Hello. Good morning. I hope all of you are doing well. Welcome to another episode of Tarot Deep Dive, where we will be taking a look at the historical and visual evolution of the 22 cards of the major arcana in the tarot. So if you're interested in any of that, be sure to stick around. My name is Dustin, by the way, and if you're new here, welcome to my channel. If you're returning, thank you so much for coming back and hanging out. And yeah, be sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, so that you don't miss any more fun, exciting, occult, esoteric, and tarot related content. Yeah, so I hope everybody's doing well today. It's been a while since we've done one of these because I was ill the last time one of these was scheduled. So, but I'm super excited because today we're going to be doing the Chariot, which is one of my favorite cards, actually. I really like the Chariot. So we're going to be deep diving into the Chariot. So I think a couple people mentioned that they're pulling out Chariot cards from all their favorite decks. That is a great thing to do. So if you have a couple favorite decks nearby, grab the Chariots out of them so you can follow along. Also, if you are interested, there is a blog post over on my website where you can follow along with all of this and use it for notes, check out my references, all of that kind of fun stuff. If you head over to my website, which we will take a look at now, all you have to do is click on blog at the very top and click on the Chariot Tarot Deep Dive, and you'll get to all of the delicious goodness, all right? So that is all ready to go for all of you. But I hope everybody's got some coffee or some tea, or if you are on the other side of the world and it's the evening, a lovely adult beverage. And I hope you're ready to dive into some Chariot energy, because it's gonna be fun. So I've got some coffee because it's the morning here. It's only 10:30 a.m. here in beautiful Colorado. It's actually very cloudy and moody out today, which is really fun. We're in that lovely springtime Colorado weather where it rains every 5 minutes, but that's okay. I love it. All right. So, as with all of my live chats, if you have a question or a comment that you would like me to see or read or look at, be sure to do at Modern Metaphysicate in chat so that it highlights it nice and bright for me, or put it in all caps so I don't miss it. Sometimes chat gets a little crazy, which I love, but if I do miss it, definitely just keep posting it and I'm sure I will get to it. You won't get in any trouble at all. If you're watching this in the future times and on the recorded version, be sure to drop your questions down in the comment section below and I'll be more than happy to answer them. I try to answer or respond to 95% of the comments that I get. So be sure to do that. Okay. So I hope everyone's got their chariots ready to go. And we'll dive into this. So the Chariot. The Chariot is the 7th card of the major arcana, and as far as a trope goes, right, in terms of the Chariot and why is this thing in the tarot deck, right? We have to remember, right? Let's just not forget that the tarot deck was created for rich people basically to play like a version of bridge. Like that's the closest like analogy I can make to what Todoroki the game actually is, right? So let's just not forget that, right? The esoteric stuff didn't come until later, but the chariot as a thing, as an object, right, has been at the forefront of sort of human warfare and transportation for thousands of years, right? The first chariot, it is assumed to be created about 3,000 years BC, so before Christ, which is a long time ago. It's like 5,000 years ago, and it was pulled by what they assume is oxen, and it was used as a mode of transportation and to move things, right? So basically like a glorified wagon, a step up from the wagon. Most wagons were double axled. The chariot was a single axle, and the thing that the single axle afforded you was the greater maneuverability, right? It can literally turn on a dime. And in terms of the chariot and its influence on us as human beings, right, it greatly changed how warfare was fought, way back throughout history, right? When we're looking at things like the Egyptians or the wars surrounding the Greco-Roman times and things like that, the chariot obviously played a huge role in history and was feared, right? The chariot was considered to be the tank of its day. It would destroy things, right? On the screen now, you should see this is a sculptural relief of the capture of the city of Ostar. Oh, I can't even say this. Ostartu by the Assyrian king Tilgath Pileser. I don't know how to say his name, the third, and this was about right around 730 BC, right? And so you can see even very early on, it was very widely recognized as this power tool in war. And that was because you could stick a couple of people or even three people on it, right? You could have the charioteer who drove the chariot, which was very fast and very maneuverable. And you oftentimes then also had a spearman and an archer on the chariot. So unlike cavalry, right, where you have to not only navigate the battlefield and fight people off and ride the horse, right, you have one person who's just focusing on getting around the battlefield. And then you have other people that are focusing on killing the enemy, right? It made a hugely strategic advantage to a lot of these battles back in history. I mean, obviously, when we look at, like, for example, even if you just look at the Ten Commandments, right? And when Moses goes to cross the sea and he parts the sea, right? You get this epic scene of the Pharaoh and all of his chariots pursuing the Jewish people and them getting washed away, and how fearful they were because, they had left days before, and because the chariots were so quick and so dangerous, right, that they caught up with them and they were terrified, right, and they had to literally cross an ocean or a sea. So in terms of like history and the chariot as a trope and a part of our sort of human psyche, right, it is an object that has long been a part of all kind of cultures, and even made its way into things like mythology and legend, right? Like Apollo is probably one of the most well-known charioteers who pulled the sun across the sky every day, or still does, with his chariot, right? So the chariot can be found all over the place, and it's for this reason that it's probably included in the deck, right? It's a major sort of it's a major sort of piece of human history, right? And so when we look at the trump cards in the tarot deck, right? They're obviously very much designed to be these like major sort of big things in humanity, especially back when the Italians were kind of first creating it and transforming things like the Mamluk deck into the tarot. Okay, so that's kind of where we are, like in a historical conflicts, right? Chariot was a big deal, it made its way everywhere, right? We from the Egyptians to the Greco-Romans, who had like the chariots in Greco-Roman times were like the NASCAR, Fortune 500 crazy souped up cars of their day, right? There were chariot races. They were used in warfare and they were used in parades, right? All of those kinds of ideas and concepts of power and transportation and wealth, right? There have been chariots that have been found that were literally encrusted in gold or bronze. And so they were expensive, right? They were, if you had a chariot, you were pretty well off, and pretty safe too on the battlefield, because it elevated you, right? It not only elevated you, it made you fast, because you could have a couple of horses, so you were a little bit faster than most, and it was very maneuverable, right? You could literally spin around, as opposed to like a wagon. And then of course, you had the ability to have multiple people, so you weren't trying to do all the jobs at once like a cavalry member was doing. So let me catch up on chat really quick and make sure we don't have any questions. I love the chariot because it's the Freudian concept of dual drives, Eros and Thanatos, and how we must understand our ID and impulse control. Interesting, yes, from a psychological perspective. Into the chariot with coffee in hand. Excellent, B. My website is so pretty. Thank you, Trish. I appreciate that. Okay, so let's press on here. So yes, the chariot obviously is majorly important in history, right? So let's look at the card, right? Let's look at how it evolved. So the first thing we're looking at here is the Visconti Sforza card. Now this card, obviously there's a couple versions of the Visconti Sforza deck. If you're not familiar with that, go check it out. But this is my favorite of the two chariots. Actually, the two chariots are quite different in the different versions of the Visconti decks. And this one's my favorite because it's pulled by two Pegasus, which I just think is absolutely beautiful and wonderful. And you kind of have the Empress, or the Papess, right, sitting atop the chariot, right? So here again, we get that idea of power and wealth and the mystical quality of the Pegasi, right, pulling the chariot, which is a hearkening back to Greco-Roman legends and like Apollo and things like that, right? So I think it's just absolutely gorgeous and beautiful. And in terms of like early decks, right, obviously the Visconti Sforza, if you're not familiar with, the Visconti Sforza sort of lineage in Italy, they were very wealthy. They were very wealthy, and these cards in fact were gold gilt. So this is kind of like the cream of the crop type thing, right? And as we move through history, right, and we look at things like the Jean Dodal Marseille deck, right, which is a little more mass-produced, wood block printed, we can see some of the more traditional depiction of the chariot as we know it today, kind of arrive, right? The sort of forward facing, that canopy that we see in the rider that we're used to, it's being pulled by two horses, right? Which is interesting. But you still get that like sort of royal, upright, noble figure, victorious in battle, pulling the chariot, right? And that's one thing, like when we look at the card and how it's evolved, like visually, right, it's one of the cards in the major arcana that really hasn't it hasn't had such a major transformation as some of the other ones have had, right? Maddie asks, which is this version? The card that is on screen right now is from the Jean Dodal tarot, which is a Tarot de Marseille. And it's one of my favorites of like all of the chariots of like the Marseille sort of spectrum, because he looks so derpy, and the horses look so derpy. I love them. They're just like the faces are just, they crack me up. The thing about Marseille that I love, and I've said it before on my channel quite often, is that the faces are what make all of the different Marseille decks worth getting, because they're all so unique and they have so much personality. It's amazing. So I love it, right? So again, we can see as we're moving forward through time, we're getting that more traditional sort of composition visually. Now, when we look at Pappas, right, we see more of the occult come into play, right? This is, of course, Pappas was one of the first who really layered occult and esoteric symbolism onto the tarot. And here we see that again, Pappas was very Egyptian, right? That a lot of that is where the myth and legend of the tarot coming out of Egypt, right? Which historically we know is not true. If anyone in this chat thinks that tarot is an Egyptian thing, we historically and factually 100% know is not true. But Pappas, that was his modus operandi, and obviously in a lot of the depictions of the cards, you see a lot of Egyptian symbolism being used. So here, again, we have a traditional chariot. We're starting to see that sort of canopy of stars being used, which is interesting, right? We have the Sphinxes, which is a huge part of the Rider-Waite-Smith card. And in fact, when I get questions about the chariot, oftentimes the thing that I get asked the most is like, what's with the Sphinxes? What are they about? And we'll talk about that here when we get down to breaking down the symbolism of the card. But in terms of the visual evolution, right? We now are being presented with these historical esoteric symbols that we've kind of come to know in the composition of the card as it exists today. Paper Moon Tarot just asked, how do you feel about modern decks using cars and motorcycles for the chariots? I think it's a great translation, right? Without the chariot, cars would not exist, right? The thing about esotericism that I think a lot of people get hung up on is that they feel like you can't, you either can't modernize it or you can't sort of modify it, or sometimes like it always fascinates me when I look at people talking about things like old ancient manuscripts and grimoires, right, where they call for these like absolutely ridiculous ingredients like the brain of an eagle, right? And even back then, right, it wasn't very easy to just go get a brain of an eagle to do the spell, right? And the book of what's the word I'm looking for here? One moment. The swarm book of Honorius. I can't say that. Honorius of Thebes. One of the things that I love about that grimoire is that he's like, look, the expensive ingredient thing, it's cool if you can afford it, cool, good for you, but like the god and the spirits and everything out there that you're using these things to kind of contact and connect with, they don't care. They're not physical beings. They don't care if you use like gold, like and so, and I think that directly translates to today, right? The point I'm trying to make is that I think that directly translates to today, where when modern creators do things like transform the chariot into a car, it still works, right? The fundamental kind of idea of the card and what it stands for and represents, right? I think it still works, and I think it's okay, right? It's a natural evolution for us to evolve the imagery and these compositions and these concepts to be more familiar with the time and place that we live in, right? We don't live in a day and age where when we look outside, we see chariots. Lest us not forget that not only 120 years ago, so at the turn of the 20th, the turn of the when we went into the 1900s, right around up until the 1920s, in fact, people were still cruising around in horse and buggies, right? So the idea of the chariot, right? Like, people were used to that. Now, in today's day and age, we are not, right? But in terms of like the grand arc of humanity, right? The chariot, this sort of vehicle of transportation and warfare and all of that, it was everywhere. So I think it's natural for us as human beings to want to translate that when a thing falls out of sort of the everyday use, right? The chariot has very obviously been replaced by the automobile. That is a thing. And so naturally, I think for modern creators, right, making that association, I think is great. I think it's natural, and I think it works. Now, in terms of like the meaning and things like that, do we lose things in meaning? Oh, maybe, and that's okay, right? But the tarot is an evolving, living thing, right? There's no tarot police. There's no sort of tarot police who's going to come and arrest you for believing that, and that's okay, right? And that's the thing about tarot and the occult and esotericism that I think a lot of people forget, right? Is that a lot of this stuff is 100% made up, 100% very poorly documented because it was kept secret, and there is no one out there who's going to come knock on your door for quote unquote reading the tarot wrong or designing a deck wrong or casting a spell wrong, right? Like, you know what? If it works for you, good for you. And that's all that matters. I don't think it was Apollo that was carrying the light, but Helios. So Helios, Apollo would pull the sun across. There's a couple different myths and legends, right? And I think you're confusing Greco and Roman myths, which are not exactly the same. Helios was Roman, I believe, and Apollo is more Greco. The point though is that the chariot was a part of mythos in history, right? And when we look at that, I would have to go back to my mythology books, but I'm pretty sure, let's see. Pulling sun. Let's look really quickly here. Yeah. So, in ancient Greek, deity Apollo, the son of Zeus, master of Olympus, rode a chariot pulled by fiery horses across the sky every day, to bring light to the world. That's, yeah. So, I think you're confusing a couple of things there, Christina. But yeah, that Apollo did that. That was his thing, and there's tons of art about it. In fact. This, I believe, where did that one famous painting go that I'm thinking of? I can't find it, but yeah. Oh yes, people do love dogma. I completely agree. I completely agree with you. Let me make sure I'm not missing. Is the chariot more associated with war though? So we'll get into that a little bit in just a bit here with the evolution of the meaning of the word and things like that. The card. So let's keep looking at how the composition and the visual language evolved, right? So we're looking at Pappas here. then we get to weight, right around 1909, if we're familiar. And here we see a direct sort of composition steal from the Marseille tradition, right? If we were to put the Marseille card right next to this card, you would see that it's almost identical, right? You have that canopy, that forward-facing charioteer who's wearing armor with epaulets. You have the two sphinxes instead of the two horses. Now, the chariot in this case is stone compared to a chariot in with wheels and wood. And it's interesting. I think a lot of people don't notice this, but the chariot in the RWS deck doesn't have wheels. Has anyone ever noticed that? I think a lot of people miss this. It's made out of stone and it doesn't have wheels. Oh, and if you also notice, the charioteer is not holding reins that are used to control and drive the horses. And the sphinxes are not attached to any sort of pulling mechanism, so they're not pulling the chariot. I think a lot of people totally just kind of glaze over that. But we'll get into that. When we break down the symbolism. And then when we get to the Thoth, right? We of course, when we look at the Thoth deck, Crowley and Lady Frida Harris sort of combine all of these traditions together in a really this is like, where the F are the wheels? Did you think there was some wheels there? So when we look at the Thoth, right, Harris and Crowley definitely do a good job of, synthesizing all of the compositions and the historical sort of visual language and symbolism and all that kind of stuff into one thing. And that's what I really love about the Thoth, right? Is that it takes all of these little bits and pieces throughout history, and then it just creates this amalgam of beautiful visual symbolism, which is really wonderful. So yeah. And here we see the wheels, we see the armored charioteer. Now he's sitting in a lotus position, which is really interesting. Of course, we have the sphinxes. We have 2 black and 2 white. We have the canopy up top, which, interestingly enough, a lot of people kind of miss that there's an inscription on the top of the canopy. The famous Crowley sort of word of power or spell, abracadabra, is kind of scrolled across the top of that canopy there. And you definitely get a sense of kind of all of the things that we looked at in terms of the visual language of the card before, right? So yeah, there's that. And you can kind of see here, right, the direct composition sort of a reference in the weight from the traditional Marseille. Okay? So that's how the card looked through time. Now let's talk about meaning, right? Now when we talk about meaning, when we're back in 1781 and we're looking at Dumoulin, I love the names of the cards. And I think this is, someone asked earlier about the question about war, right? A lot of times today when we look at, I want to be nice here. When we look at hyper fluffy and light washed sort of interpretations of the tarot, they're like, oh, the chariot is about movement and victory and transportation and journeys and things like that. When really that's just never been a meaning of the card, historically, which I just love. It's like, where did this come from? But when we look at some of the oldest interpretations, esoteric interpretations and titles of the cards, right? The Chariot of War was one of the very first, right? Crimes of the Iron Age. That's not a very positive, it's not a very positive interpretation for a card, right? When we get to Eliphas Levi in 1855, right? He refers to it as the Hebrew letter Zain, I think is how you say that. I'm really bad with Hebrew letters. The cubic chariot, weapon, sword, cherubic sword of fire, the sacred septenary, triumph, royalty, priesthood, right? So we still have very much that idea of war being presented, of conflict, and again, when we think about chariots, right, we think about, usually there's a couple things that pop into people's mind: war and chariot races, right? Those are the two things, like, historically, that are kind of ingrained in our brains, right? When we get to Mathers in 1888, he calls it the Chariot, triumph, victory, and overcoming obstacles. Okay, and then we get to the Golden Dawn. Child of the power of the waters, Lord of the triumph of light. The Chariot, triumph, victory, health, success, though sometimes not enduring, right? So again, we're getting this sense of, like, victory, right? Which when we think about it, right, makes sense, because a lot of times when we see chariots in historical art presentations, we see them as part of victory sort of propaganda art, right? Here again, from the Mesopotamia area, or Assyria, we see this depiction of a king conquering his foes, capturing a city, enthroned in his chariot, right? This vehicle of power. So that definitely carries on through time in the meaning of the card. In 1910, Waite writes that it's called the Chariot. It represents providence, war, triumph, presumption, and vengeance. Right? Not very fluffy. And this is Waite, right? This is this card, you guys, right? Which is why when I read how to read tarot things and they say that this is, like, about transportation and really happy things, I'm like, where are you guys getting this? And if that's the way you want to read the card, that's fine, right? There's no tarot police. They're not going to come and tell you to read the card the way that I'm telling you to read the card. All I'm doing is presenting the historical sort of background, right? Because I think it's important that as tarot readers, right, we have that foundation of knowledge to look at and understand and build from, and choose, if we so desire, to deviate from, and why. But understanding the why, I think, is the important thing. Just throwing the book away because your feelings say so, I think that's a little careless, in my opinion. And then, of course, we get to Crowley, who is ever so eloquent with his words. I can't even say this word correctly ever. The Ophiuchus wears an amber-colored armor, which is suitable for the symbol. The mask of the helmet was pulled down so no one could see his face. For the same reason, none of his body parts were revealed. He sat still on the chariot instead of directing it because of the entire operating system was in perfect balance. His role is to keep the Holy Grail. So you get this idea of, like, armored, being ready for war, as well as, like, defending things, and crusade, right? That's kind of like the vibe you get from that, right? But when we look at the evolution of the card's meaning, right? How is the Chariot? So the Chariot is associated with the card Cancer. So when we look at, for example, when we look at Crowley and Lady Frida Harris's card, you actually see the crab up on the top of the guy's head, which I think is fantastic, right? Yeah, the thing you have to remember with astrological associations is those were tacked on much later. And that's one of the reasons why when you look at things like the Golden Dawn compared to the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, right, we get switches between things like strength and justice, okay? So they literally were, like, forcing associations onto these cards, right? So a lot of it has to do with numerology and less so what the cards mean or represent historically. And of course, those associations then transformed the cards' meanings through time as those esoteric layers were added on and sort of changed through history. So keep that in mind when we're talking about that. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the historical reading of the card, right, it definitely leans more towards that idea of victory and triumph in battle or whatever, right? As well as overcoming obstacles, as well as war and those kinds of things, so like conflict, right? And I think that's where today we start to get those ideas of like controlling opposing forces, right? Which, when we talk about opposing forces, that's war, right? I think it's just a much fluffier way to say that, which is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And there's a lot of symbolism that kind of points to that sort of control over opposition, right? Even when you look at the historical symbolism and visual language that's presented in the cards, as well as the actual sort of definitions that were applied to these cards when people started reading them cartomatically, right? Perhaps the defensive protection of the Chariot associates with the meaning of the Cancer. Yeah, that's one of them, right? Especially when you look at things like when you look at the way that Crowley presents the card and the Golden Dawn, right? You definitely get that sense of like armored protection and things like that. Crab crown, lol. Yes, exactly. All right. So the other thing I do want to point out too is that the Chariot, right, this card right here, concludes the first of the 3 septenaries or divisions of 7 of the major arcana, right? So when we're talking about the Fool's Journey in the tarot, you can divide it into 3 sets of 7, okay? So if you pull the Fool out, right, 21 divided by 3, 7. The first set of 7, or septenary, ends with the Chariot, right? And when we look at the traditional sort of way that the Marseille presents the tarot, is that first chunk of the Fool's Journey is about meeting people and overcoming obstacles in the mundane and everyday world, right? He meets the lovers, he meets the people who rule over him, the emperor and the empress. He has to go through learning and religious studies with the Hierophant. He has choices to make when he gets to the lovers and all of that sort of stuff. So this is sort of like that end point of that first septenary in the major arcana, right? And interestingly enough, one of the other titles for this cards is Triumph, which is where we kind of get the word triomphe, which is also where we get the idea of trumps, right? So this is kind of like the trump card. And the initial meaning of this card did start out simply as like victory over war and things like that. But as you can see, instead of the card transforming in a way, the way things like the Magician did, right? Where it started out as like the trickster or, the guy who's trying to steal your money into this like representation of power and manifestation. This card just kind of grew up a little, right? It started as war and victory and kind of kept that. And just kind of layered different sort of associative meaning on top of it, okay? So yeah. The Trump of Trump cards. Let me just catch up on chat really quickly. Cancer is cardinal water, which makes sense for the Chariot. Yep. Oh, thanks, Trish. Okay, so let's keep going here. Again, if you have any if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in chat for me, okay? How are we doing on time, by the way? Oh, we're doing good. We're right at about half an hour. So we've looked at the evolution of the visual evolution of the card, right? How it's evolved over time visually. We've looked at how the meaning of the card has evolved over time, but let's dive into the specific symbolism that occurs within the RWS card, right? So if you have an RWS handy, grab your Chariot card, and we're going to break this down, right? So the Sphinxes, right? This is probably the one thing that people ask me the question about the most in terms of symbolism within this card. And the Sphinxes represent duality, right? We get this kind of directly from Pappas, both positive and negative, right? And opposing forces, right? They kind of represent all of those kind of ideas, yin and yang, right? Masculine and feminine, etc. And Sphinxes in general have a long-standing history of representing mysteries, right? Things that are uncontrollable. Of course, made famous by the famous myth of the riddle of the Sphinx, right? And for those of you who don't know the riddle of the Sphinx, it goes a little something like this. What goes on 4 feet in the morning, 2 feet at noon, and 3 feet in the evening? And for those of you who don't know, the answer is a human, right? You crawl around as a baby, you walk as an adult, and you use a cane, a 3rd foot, when you're old. And so the two Sphinxes here, right, again, is that idea of being in control of opposing forces, okay? Being victorious and triumphing over those kinds of things, whether it's war or the Sphinxes, whatever, right? That's kind of where they were going with this. Now, on the Chariot, the Chariot is made of stone, right? And there's no wheels. And there are a couple reasons for this. In my research, there was never really anything definitive. And by the way, for those of you interested in the books that I used to research all of this and put all of these kinds of presentations together, there is always a reference section at the bottom of each of the blog posts. So if you're interested in good books about tarot symbolism and the history of tarot and things like that, check out that. Let's see. I want to grow to... Where is my Chariot? The riddle in the middle of... that riddle was in my middle school world history textbook. Yeah, it's world famous. It really is. Everyone knows the riddle of the Sphinx. At least you should, in my opinion, right? That's like a go-to. But one of the things I don't talk about in the blog post so much, right, is the fact that the Chariot is made of, like, a block of stone. It is like a cube of stone, right? And it does kind of represent sort of the space we occupy, and the fact that even though the world around us seems like it's constantly in chaos and opposing forces, that we can't simply just like change the world, right? It's that grounding sort of quality, I think, is the reason why they're depicting it as stone without wheels. It's kind of like one of those ideas of destiny, right? That like we can't change the direction of destiny, which I think is kind of what they were getting at. But the thing is like there's no real evidence for that kind of interpretation. Like Waite didn't really write about why they chose to depict it as a block of stone, so a lot of that is just hearsay, right? A lot of it's just kind of drawing conclusions. Now, when we look at the front of that block, right, we see the winged disc, and this is a very ancient traditional symbol that you see quite often in ancient Egypt, and it's a power symbol, right? It was associated with divinity and royalty, and sort of that kind of concept. So again, we have that idea of being in control, right? Below that is what is considered to be Yoni and Lingam representation. This is kind of debated scholarly. But a lot of people agree that this is kind of what this represents. But these are the traditional representations of the masculine and feminine in India. And of course, they're unified here. So again, you have another sort of reference to controlling oppositions or the bringing together of opposites into victory, right? Now, the canopy of stars and the laureled crown of stars, right? The canopy kind of represents the mastery and victory over the temporal plane, right? So, like, I have conquered all of the things under the stars. And the crown, now, interestingly enough, there are a lot of references to a 6-pointed star in some books that I found. There were definitely 8 points on that star. On his crown, on the primary crown. And which is interesting to me, right? Because the 8-pointed star and the 6-pointed star have different meanings symbolically, like when we're talking strictly symbolism. So if we go with the 8-pointed star, which is my opinion, and I think there are a lot of people that agree with this, but it represents his connection to the celestial world and the divine, right? And that it also kind of represents the mastery over the cardinal and intercardinal directions. So the mastery of the world around him. And for those of you who don't, cardinal, north, south, east, west, intercardinal, right? Northeast, southeast, northwest, etc. So, it kind of represents the compass. And the number 8 was frequently associated in Judeo-Christian traditions with things like beginnings and resurrection and salvation, right? So you have this idea of these kind of ideologies in Judeo-Christian worlds that you see kind of echoed in meanings and interpretations for the Chariot card that we see today. Okay? As well as the divisions of the Wheel of the Year, which goes way back to pagan times, right? And is used in neo-pagan traditions today. All right. Let's see. What do the moon shoulder... Well, we're going to talk about the moon shoulder pads right now, Trish. I love your reference sections. Oh, thank you, Nikki. I appreciate that. Leanne says so I think this is in reference to the chariot being made out of stone. To represent the chariot is a force that doesn't rely on conventional means to move, I guess. Yeah, without wheels. I think that's a really great interpretation, actually. Okay, so the moon epaulets or shoulder pads. So Waite actually specifically talks about this in Pictorial Key to the Tarot. He describes the shoulders as Urim and Thummim, which are mentioned in the books of Samuel, and they are worn by priests to arbitrate with God on the behalf of mankind. So again, you get this sense of the charioteer being victorious over the realm around him, being sort of granted divine power, and almost a divine power to rule, right? There's a kind of a link to the Emperor card there. And these epaulets represent his ability, therefore, then to start communing with God, right? Which then, as we move into the next set of septenaries, right, we start moving into the more sort of nebulous concepts of the major arcana, as opposed to just like meeting some cool people that we see in the first septenary, right? Then when we look at the rest of his regalia, right, so the apron, now a lot of people think these are zodiacal symbols. They're not. I've seen some references on websites, blog posts, and books that they're zodiacal. They're definitely not. And there is some evidence for this, but adorned on his apron are many different occult symbols, most notably geomantic symbols from like geomancy. If you're not familiar with geomancy, that's a whole different discussion. But they're geomantic symbols that were adopted by the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn was big on geomancy. They thought it was really cool. And then, of course, that comes from Agrippa, who is a historical sort of occultist and left us some really wonderful grimoires. And they're thought to be aspects of conjunction, right? Or so the idea of the coming together or the union of things, right? So again, we get this symbolic representation of control and victory over opposition, right? And then we have the scepter, right? Or the wand. And again, much like in the Emperor card, this symbolizes power. The scepter represents the sovereign's temporal power and is associated with good governance, right? So you have his ability to talk to God on the behalf of mankind, and he's got the scepter, which says that he can therefore govern the will of God because of his victorious ability to unify opposition, right? All of these kind of ideas of war. Okay. Also, it's worth noting that the charioteer holds no reins, right? And that the scepter is the only thing in his hands, and this symbolizes his control through like, pure will and mind. Okay, right? So he's not physically controlling. This is a spiritual control. This is his ability to control things, without physical force, which I think is really interesting to point out. So those are kind of the big symbols. There are a couple other symbols, right? Like we talked about the fact that it's made out of the chariot itself is made out of stone. If we go and look at the card itself again, there's a city in the background. So this idea that he's conquered the city. There's also a river or a body of water that is right behind him. So the idea that, again, when we talk about the symbolism of water, right, we get the idea of flexibility and intuition, and the idea of your mental and spiritual powers, not your physical powers. So you get that kind of echoed again in terms of the symbolism being presented here. So yeah, the Chariot card is full of some really cool ideas and concepts, and you can see some of these things carried forward like into Crowley's card, right? But we're not going to get too much into Crowley symbolism because that's a whole nother kit and caboodle. And if you're interested in that, check out Fortune's Wheelhouse podcast, which is really great for that. Okay. The yellow things on the side are the wheels. Yes. So the wheels, a lot of people think that these are representative of the wheels. The interesting thing is that you can't see them being connected, and that they're also above the ground, so they don't drive anything, right? There's also people that say that those are like wood posts, I've read. So there's different interpretations of that. But because of the placement of the sphinxes, right, who are the keepers of mystery, you can't tell whether or not they actually are wheels, or if there's like some sort of like wood structure there, or if the wheels are even touching the ground, if they are wheels. So there's a lot of really interesting play there when it comes to the composition on the part of Pamela Coleman Smith. Now, when we look at the more traditional Marseille depictions of this card, right? You can see the ground, you can see the wheels, you can see the horses. Horses are outside of that, right? So obviously, when Waite and Pixie were working on this card, right, they took very heavy influences from Marseille in terms of the composition. They layered on some of the esoteric deliciousness and Egyptian sort of references that we see in the early sort of versions of esoteric tarot from Pappas and Levi, etc. And they kind of present us with this like new composition that mostly harkens to the Marseille, but layers in all of these ideas of mystery and controlling the unknown, right? A victory over opposing forces, all of those kinds of things. So again, right, the point of this series really is to make you guys look at the cards more closely, to investigate these things on your own, to research them, right? There's a lot of differing opinions out there. And I don't think, there's right or wrong ones. The only primary source material that we have from Waite about his deck, for the most part, there are other references, but the sort of like key source is the pictorial key to the tarot, of course. And it's one of those things where when you look more closely at these things and you look at the historical meaning of these cards and how they evolved from the earlier versions of the tarot that were specifically designed to be a card game, right? And then how the esoteric sort of meanings and things that like that were layered on top of them, and how the art and the meaning of the card evolved because of that, right? You can really start to pick apart the key symbols within the tarot and use that to enhance your readings, right? As opposed to just reading some random book off the wall that sometimes I feel like these authors aren't even researching things, right? Because they're like, the tarot or the Chariot is about movement and great journey and things like that, and it's like, what? Which, yes, I can understand some of those associations, and it's not to say that they're wrong, right? But the point is to make you look at these things and question these things and try and understand the historical background, the symbolic meaning of these things, right? Because symbolism is the most ancient form of written language that we have, right? The things that we see presented in the tarot existed long before the tarot existed. And they had meaning. And there was a reason why early versions of the tarot, when we look at things like the Visconti Sforza or any of the ancient Marseille or anything like that, there's a reason why the creators and the artists chose those compositions and those visual cues to make you think about things, right? Whether it's philosophical, esoteric, occult, right? All of those things are choices, right? And then when we look at how people like Pappas and Levi and all of those sort of early occultists transformed what was a playing card game into a form of divination, right? Then you have this visual language and knowledge base to pull from when it comes to doing your readings, right? At the end of the day, I think it makes you a better reader. Now, that's not to say that more intuitive interpretations are not correct, right? But, right, intuition is informed by the knowledge that we have, right? So the more knowledge that we have about these pictures and what they represent and what their historical context is and where they come from, the better readings we can give, right? I think that's the whole point of this, right? And the idea is to stimulate you guys, get you guys looking at your cards more closely, thinking about the symbols that are there and researching them on your own, right? Grab a symbology book, right? Like one of my favorites is this book, right? The Book of Symbols. This is a Taschen book. You'll find this in almost every Barnes & Noble, I promise. And it's on Amazon really cheaply, right? But, sometimes when I get a new deck and there's a art historical symbolic reference to something and I don't quite remember or recognize it, I pop this baby open and I look it up like, oh, what are they trying to tell me here? Because, there's everything in here, right? In fact, they have a whole page dedicated to the car as a symbol. So, that's the goal of these, right? Exactly, Tammy Pie, exactly. Cool. Well, that's pretty much it for the Chariot deep dive. We've looked at all of that. Of course, all the references are here. So if you want to further research these things or read more about them, you can find all of that here. Are there any questions in chat before we wrap things up? If you're watching this in future times and you have any questions or comments at all, feel free to drop them in the comments section below. I love comments and questions. They're my favorite. Well, you guys have had some great questions today, by the way. And we'll give you guys a couple minutes because I know that there is a slight delay with the live stream. I think accompanying blog posts are gold. Thank you. Thank you. Yep. And you can always find them. The blog posts are always there on the website. And if you're interested in the rest of this series, all you have to do is go to the blog on my website. There's lots and lots of stuff in here. If you specifically want to see just tarot-related content, click on tarot at the top. And in here, you'll see an order, the tarot deep dive, going all the way back to our dear Fool. So be sure to check all those. And there's videos for all of them. So, and I try to do these once a month. So if you're interested in this kind of content, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe so that you don't miss the next one. Yep, all of the videos are also linked in these blog posts. So if you're looking for the specific video, it's in there. So, for example, if we go to the High Priestess, you can see all the usual High Priestess things in the videos right here. And you can go check that out. So it's all there in the blog. Smashed, thank you. Goodness gracious. So, while we are talking about sort of housekeeping things, next Sunday, there will not be a live on this channel. I will be going live over on the 3 Fat Readers channel with Lisa Papez, who's in chat, and Danny Mystic. And we are going to be doing a really, really fun tag that involves us sharing childhood photos of ourselves. I won't spoil too much, but some of you may have figured it out already. So if you're interested in seeing the 3 of us as babies, be sure to come hang out on 3 Fat Readers next Sunday. I think Lisa just posted a link to that channel in the chat. If you're watching this in future times, there is a link to 3 Fat Readers in the description box below. And down there, you'll also find links to all of my social media where you can reach out and connect with me, as well as a link to my personal website where you can purchase some of my own handmade metaphysical goods and all that fun stuff. And now that the Hellacious Tower year of 2020 is over, and I am feeling much better and my health has returned, there's going to be lots of really cool, exciting updates coming on the website, new tarot reading offerings, new things in the shop, etc. So be sure to keep an eye on that space. So yeah. Oh, thank you, Princess. I appreciate that. You guys are the best. Well, I don't see any more questions in chat, so I just do want to say thank you all so much for coming to hang out. As always, I super appreciate each and every one of you for coming and chatting, or if you just hung out and lurked. I appreciate all of you too, because I used to be a lurker and I totally understand. And I still lurk quite a bit because I like to do things while I'm watching videos. So I appreciate each and every one of you so very much. So thank you for all of your love and support. And as always, remember, everyone is fighting a battle that you know nothing about. So be kind always. And we'll see you guys on YouTube. Have an awesome Sunday, everyone. Bye.